But now we can move to the panel. Panel number one, if I can call up Bo Normander, Mia Macdonald, and Bob Engelman. And now, panels at the symposium are very much, the hope is lots of time for Q&A. So I'm going to just ask one introductory question after a very brief introduction of each of them, and then we're opening it up to the audience. So please feel free to, if you've read some of their chapters and you already have a question in your mind, feel free to jump up ambitiously as one of the first questioners. I think I'll just stay here and work from here. But let me introduce Mia first. Mia is a long-time senior fellow at Worldwatch Institute, first of all, but also the executive director of Brighter Green, a nonprofit public policy organization that focuses on sustainability, the environment, and food, and has long researched sustainability and agricultural issues, most recently writing Food Security and Equity in a Climate-Constrained World for State of the World 2012, unless there's even something more recent. But I hope, considering this is coming out today, this is the most recent. Let me just start. I think I'll do the introductions after the first question, so just going through. But so let me start with a first question to you, Mia, just on your chapter. I mean, ultimately, you're going to see a theme in all my questions, which is how does this issue relate with sustainable prosperity? And yours is a very challenging one because so deeply do we understand eating higher on the food chain with prosperity, unfortunately, in a sense. And now there are more and more people choosing a higher impact diet. In fact, there are now 9 times the number of livestock on the planet than human beings. The ultimate question, is this a problem? Is our food system, especially meat production, sustainable? And if it's not, where do we go from here?
Thank you, Erik. That's a very good question. And I want to thank everyone at Worldwatch who helped organize this forum and for the great work that you all have done on a daily basis, and seeing the book out in the world is terrific. So yes, I've been asked to be brief, so I will be, and then hopefully we can discuss some more in the Q&A session. The main challenge that I see, and obviously others see as well, is we have created in the industrialized world a food system based on high consumption and also monocultures, with livestock really at the center. And that has spread, it's in the United States, it's in Europe, it's kind of an artifact of the post-World War period, in some ways of turning swords into plowshares. But the challenge is that as we see the downsides of this system in our own country, and I'll come back to that in a minute, at the same time, it is being globalized. And there are a number of reasons for that, and I discuss some of those in the chapter. So just briefly to talk about certainly trends of urbanization, certainly a growing middle class around the world, also agribusinesses, food retailers, the food economy becoming more globally integrated, and producers looking for new markets. So we could say that the US, Europe, Australia, New Zealand are probably saturated right now in terms of fast food. But other places around the world, unfortunately, are not. And so that is seen as a market opportunity. Fast food has spread quite rapidly in places like China, Brazil. It's even making inroads in India, as well as other parts of the world. Now, in the United States and Europe, in the past several years, including to some wonderful work by Daniel Nierenberg and others, Robert Goodland, who's in the room, this system of intensive animal agriculture has been rethought as we look at the climate impacts, enormous greenhouse gases, enormous reliance on fossil fuels, considerable water pollution from manure and runoff from these intensive operations that can house tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of animals in one facility in very confined and very cruel conditions, I think we can say, for sentient beings. And there are about almost 70 billion of them being used in the global food system every year. We see challenges around air pollution. We see soil erosion. We see challenges to food security because of the inherent inefficiency of feeding food, principally grain, to animals instead of consuming that grain ourselves. So anywhere from 2 to 10 pounds of grain or feed required for every pound of animal food. And as we see a growing population that Bob will talk more about, has been mentioned earlier, and see people eating higher up the food chain, the resource intensity is only increasing. We have 1 billion people underfed. We have probably more than 1 billion people who are obese or overweight, and yet another billion people who, while not technically underfed, do not eat well, do not get sufficient nutrients. But as we eat higher up on the food chain, as we produce more and more animal products, the space to really create food security is increasingly limited because resources are being directed to production of animal-based foods, meat, but also dairy products and eggs, leaving, fewer resources, fewer space for really bringing about food equity, where people have enough, where they eat well, where there is abundance, but within reason, shall we say. Not luxury, but good, healthy, nutritious food is available to everyone. We don't have that system now. Brighter Green's research has focused on a number of countries, including emerging economies, looking at some of these trends, looking at the intersection of climate change and intensification of animal agriculture. And I'll just spend a minute giving a couple examples from those, because the speed and scale of the change of this adoption of intensive animal agriculture, systems of factory farming, is very, very quick. It took more time to become embedded in the industrialized world than it is making inroads in the global south and other regions. So, for example, in China, already animal agriculture is a leading source of water pollution, and Chinese meat consumption is still less than half of what the U.S. consumption is. Non-communicable diseases due to changing diet, more sedentary lifestyles are going up very, very quickly in China and is an area of concern for the government. In India, India, with a long history of ethical vegetarianism, now is the 5th largest producer of chickens for meat in the world, more than 2 billion a year. The Indian poultry industry is putting increased pressure on the government, for more grain supplies for those birds to eat, even as India has many millions and millions of malnourished children, which is basically a crisis. So we again see the resource shift, demand for grain to feed to animals, to by and large a middle class, a more affluent population. Most rural Indians will get to eat perhaps an egg a week, if that, whereas a middle class Indian, a more wealthy Indian, can eat many, many eggs in a week. In Brazil, certainly the issue of deforestation, I'm sure, is not unfamiliar to most of you in this room for cattle ranching. But there is also destruction of the Brazilian savanna, known as a cerrado, for cattle, but also to produce soybeans, which are used in the Brazilian agricultural economy as well as exported around the world, including to China. A recent study suggested that about half of Brazil's overall greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to the cattle sector alone. Even in a place like Ethiopia, where there is very, very little industrial animal agriculture, there's a very large population of livestock and increasing interest in intensifying animal agriculture to serve export markets and to bring foreign exchange into the country. So again, potential real conflicts there between human needs for food and feeding animals to then feed to, by and large, wealthier people, even people outside of the country. So that's kind of the glass half empty. In terms of the glass half full, I'd just like to touch on a couple of the measures that I explore in the chapter that I think are needed to basically rebalance this system, to interrupt the increased spread of intensive animal agriculture and stave off some of the really important issues around climate equity, climate space, resource space, public health. And some of those will require government action, some of those will require action by civil society, many of us in this room maybe from either or both of those sectors, as well as individuals. So I'll just mention 3 points. The first is that I believe we need stronger government policies everywhere in the industrialized world as well as other countries that take the externalities of animal agriculture, things like water pollution, things like greenhouse gas emissions, things like air pollution, and bring those onto the balance sheet. So those are no longer free, which obviously is a massive subsidy to the livestock sector and fuels the process of intensification. Second, I think that there's an important need for governments and civil society to discuss together, and obviously that's many, many people with many different interests and perspectives, but to seek a national dialogue to create the space for that around what is a sustainable, humane, climate-friendly food system, and work to create systems that are based principally on varied regional plant-based cuisines, which we can find in basically every society around the world, and look to shape a food system around making those broadly available and accessible. And what would that look like? And what are the different roles for the various parties, governmental and non? And then finally, work around public education, both by government entities as well as civil society, as well as individuals, around what is healthy eating, what is sustainable eating, what is climate-friendly eating, and perhaps expanding programs like Meatless or Meat-Free Mondays, working to make these foods that are healthy, more climate compatible, more broadly accessible. And again, education needs, but also government policies that will allow the public education that people may well receive for them to act on that. And I think that that is also an important issue of equity, for us to recognize that people in many societies, the amount of choices can differ broadly. And so we want to make a sustainable, climate-compatible, humane food system accessible to all. So it isn't something only for elites in whatever society where they find themselves. I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mia. Next question to Bo Normander. Bo is the director of Worldwatch Europe, also a member of the Copenhagen City Council. We almost pulled him on the second urban-themed panel, but we also wanted to really dig into his chapter, which he wrote on biodiversity combating the sixth mass extinction. And I think that's a really key issue and central to sustainable prosperity. But I, for one, and probably many of us in the room, might not understand the exact links of how biodiversity is important for our well-being and for sustainability. And I'd love if, Bo, your first question was simply just giving us a better understanding on the links between human well-being and biodiversity.
Well, thank you, Erik. And if you give me about 1 hour.
Sorry, 5 minutes.
And also, yeah, well, I should, as a local politician in Copenhagen, I should not speak like a politician, but politicians tend to speak forever. So I'll try to be short. And well, first of all, what is biodiversity? Why should we at all be concerned about biodiversity? And there's been a European survey asking people about biodiversity, and it showed up that 2 out of 3 had heard about biodiversity, but only 1 out of 3 could kind of explain what it is. And I guess it's probably about the same here in the US, that a lot of people don't really know what it is. But when in the same survey, if people were explained about biodiversity, they were very, concerned about how to protect biodiversity. So what is biodiversity? It's short for biological diversity. It's the diversity, the variation of life, so to say. It's all the living things, all species, and it's not just a scientific word. I think if you compare it to climate change, if you go 10 years back, no one knew about climate change or about all those things that we're discussing today, and I think the same is with biodiversity, that it will be the new climate change when people start to understand the loss of biodiversity, what it means, this word, then there will be a lot more attention. I hope that we won't forget climate change, but biodiversity, I think, is an emergent issue. And why is it important? I think that as Severn from Canada also mentioned in her speech, that we are talking about the 6th mass extinction. That means that a UN study shows that the rate that we lose species now is 100 to 1,000 times higher than 200 years ago. So basically we are wiping out species much faster than at any time in history. And so for the first time we are facing a mass extinction that is caused by an individual, human beings. The 5th mass extinction was 65 million years ago. It was the end of the what is it called in Cretaceous? Is it called in English? Period, where it wiped out all the dinosaurs, as you may know. And but today we are experiencing the 6th mass extinction, and we need to. So why is biodiversity important for well-being, as Erik asked? Well, you can first of all think about it. If you feel depressed, then you should go out and enjoy biodiversity. That means that if it has a direct impact on your well-being. So being in nature, enjoying butterflies or whatever, nice flowers, plants, green trees, and so on, that will help you on your well-being. A Swedish study showed that with patients suffering with depression, when they were treated in parks, when they spent time in parks and green areas, they recovered faster and had a higher success rate. So it shows that you are, as a human being, you are part of nature and you are very close to biodiversity. So that is the diversity of nature, the richness of nature. And that's the direct link between biodiversity and well-being. But then you have a number of other links, and there's also several studies on this, that all our basic needs are provided by species, by ecosystems. Clean water, our food systems, bees are pollinating our crops, and so on. So we are so much dependent on a rich biodiversity, and we cannot afford what we're doing today, losing so many species and so many ecosystems. The last thing I could try to conclude on is that when I flew into Washington yesterday, I was flying over Greenland, and there you see a lot of you don't see much biodiversity, but you see nature, and in Canada and so on. And then I looked out of the window, and when I was coming closer to Washington D.C., everything turned into squares, and that shows. And it's even worse in Denmark. In Denmark, everything is really square. So even when you look out the window, you see the fields, you see the cities, you see the factories. Even the forests are square. And that means that that's not good for biodiversity, because you cannot. It means that we have taken over land use as human beings. We are so much in control of what we use the land for, and we need. That's the most important thing, I think, is to protect what we have of nature and biodiversity, and not divide everything into squares. It is really important that we also at the Rio Plus 20 meeting conference, that there will be a focus on how to conserve land nature, pristine nature, stop deforestation, so that in order to stop the loss of biodiversity. So, thank you.
You can pass that way. Thanks very much, Bo. And you can already see the interlinkages just between these two chapters, between the undermining of biodiversity through our food system and the need for that. And even there's a great box in Bo's chapter about urban biodiversity and how that can be facilitated. Last but certainly not least is Bob Engelman, the president of Worldwatch, who I don't think needs much introducing at this point, but since he was too humble to mention it, I will mention his long-standing research into population, including his book, More, Population, Nature, and What Women Want. And for State of the World 2012, Bob wrote 9 population strategies to stop short of 9 billion. Of course, we know that this past fall we hit the 7 billion mark just 13 years after hitting the 6 billion mark, and the UN projects that the population could hit as high as 9 billion. This, of course, means more ecological demands on the planet as these new individuals go about living their lives, and many strive to be a part of the consumer society. So I think the relationship between population and prosperity, sustainable prosperity, might be clearer in that sense. But the question is there really still a possibility that we can slow population growth down and get the peak population lower than 9 billion people through a series of 9 or any number of strategies? And even if so, ultimately, how do we convince the world's leaders that just as economic growth isn't necessarily good for the world?
Tough questions when you've already heard plenty from me, so I'll try to answer them really simply, oversimply, which will be hard. Population is a scale factor of just about everything we're talking about today. So I certainly saw through a number of the slides where population, even if it wasn't mentioned, and it often was just a key element in the sustainability sweet spot, and what the footprint is of nations has a lot to do with how many people they have. Erik's interesting graph of sort of how many people can the world support at what levels of income or lifestyle. I don't know that I would buy into the idea that we can quantify the number as exactly as some do, but there's some truth to this idea that in a limited planet, in a finite planet, there are definitely trade-offs, so that as you have more people and as you are trying to provide sustainable prosperity for more people, the bar of sustainability keeps sort of receding even as you're reaching for it, simply because more people want to live well. They certainly have the right to live well. Nobody can claim they've got more of a right than anyone else to live well. So as population grows, you're continually facing this ever greater pressure or ever greater challenge for sustainability itself. It's not talked about very much, I think, just simply because it's regarded as a kind of something on its own path that can't be affected. The demographers have told us we're going to be 9 billion in 2050, or actually a little bit more. What can be done, and probably more importantly because it's seen as so sensitive and so intrusive of people's individual lives and rights and values, because we still for the most part have a fairly 1960s view of population as being something that has to be controlled, that couples and women need to be told to have fewer children than they want to have. The reality of the story of population is actually it's one of the most popular, it's one of the most successful and hopeful in the whole sustainability issue, in that there's been a not well-noticed social revolution that has occurred for sustainability over the past 30 or 40 years without really a huge effort on the part of somebody trying to plan or control how it would unfold. It had a lot to do with government action, but it had even more to do with modernization, and particularly the beginnings of acceptance that women in particular should be able to make decisions for themselves about when and whether to have children. And that's where there is so much hope in the whole picture. We actually have a family size worldwide that's half of what it was in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, I was intrigued by your hamster graph. Erik. You don't have to actually personify it with a hamster. In the late 1960s, a well-known Princeton demographer who's so well-known I can't immediately call his name to mind, did this calculation of what would be the result of the then existing rates of growth of humanity, which at the time were about 2%. And basically, after about 6,000 years, humanity was a mass of protoplasm expanding into the universe at the speed of light. So he concluded ultimately you can't grow faster than about 2% a year for 6,000 years. That's a physical law. It's not a social law. It's a physical law. Well, it's an interesting. I mean, if you want to find a definition of what sustainability or unsustainability is, that's not a bad one. And unless you think that that's unrealistic, we have a lot slower growth now than we did then. Even at current rates of fertility, that is the fertility we have now, which is about 2.5 children per woman. And as everyone knows, it's about 2 children per woman that produces a stable population, which isn't even accurate. But I'll try to say more about that if I have time in a second. But even if we did not change or lower human fertility even more than it is now, and we continued growing as we're growing to the year 2300, the United Nations Population Division did a scenario for what that would look like. Just at current fairly low rates of fertility, which a lot of politicians worry about in a lot of countries, by the year 2300, the population of the world would be in the trillions, and we would effectively be standing on each other's heads. Now, a lot of people think there's still a lot of room in Texas for the whole world population to move. They don't ask Texans how they feel about that, but that's laughed about a lot. But I think it's very, very clear that we can't sustain that kind of growth, either in developed countries, which I should say are still growing. There's a myth that developed countries are through growing. Even Europe as a continent continues to grow its population. Certainly the 3 most consumer-oriented or consumptive populations that we have in the world on a per capita basis, 2 of which have been discussed extensively today, the United States, Canada, and the 3rd is Australia, all have rates of population growth that are fairly similar to the world as a whole, Canada being the lowest, but the United States and Australia being quite high. So it isn't just a problem for developing countries. But in developing countries, it's clear that population growth was a contributor to Arab Spring, the fact that governments are increasingly incapable of feeding their own people, most notably in Egypt, where most wheat comes from the United States, but also in Syria, in Yemen, where water is such a controversial issue that public officials are regularly outed for digging wells in their own backyards. Tom Friedman wrote about this just a few days ago in the New York Times. Well, why can't you dig a well in your own backyard? Because you're taking water that belongs to the whole country, and this is a country that has so little water that soon there are going to be trucks bringing water into the capital city. So what might we think about that? Well, the really positive thing, and this is work that Worldwatch is doing right now, and one of the things that brought me to Worldwatch several years ago is the fact that since Lester Brown founded the organization in the mid-70s, Worldwatch is an environmental organization that has seen population as a cornerstone of the sustainability debate and has been consistent on that. And work we're doing now is actually looking at answering a fundamental question, which is, suppose that women really had the children they actually wanted to have. Suppose that women became pregnant when they really wanted to have a child and did not become pregnant when they did not want to have a child. Fairly simple question. What would be the demographic implications of that? And the initial work that we've done so far is pretty positive and pretty optimistic that that would effectively immediately reduce the world's fertility rate to below replacement. That isn't actually 2, it's something below about 2.3 because sadly, and this is a point we need to consider, enough children still die in the world, and enough girls are not born in comparison to boys in the world, and girls, of course, are the child bearers as they grow up, that replacement fertility worldwide is actually more than 2.3. But if women could make their own choices, it would be well below 2.3, and we would immediately poise the world toward a reduction of population sometime in the next few decades. And I think, and I'm not able to prove it, but we have a project at Worldwatch designed to see if we can demonstrate this, actually coming under the 9 billion that the United Nations is talking about. Well, so there's a complicated question there. What would it take for that to happen? It isn't just about family planning, although that's an issue I've worked on for a long time. Clearly, universal access to the means of preventing pregnancy is critical for men and for women everywhere in the world, and that's step number 1 of the 9 that I present. But it also has to do, obviously, with the status of women, the education of women and girls. It has to do with sexuality education, and it has to do with a range of other issues that all work together for a sustainable environment. Pricing environmental goods. My town considered, for example, the idea of actually charging, considered this very briefly, charging people for garbage on the basis of weight. My wife and I hardly can find anything to take out. And I don't mean to say we're wonderful. My wife is a very strong recycler, and we barely have anything to bring out to the trash. And I wish we had this system, but we pay as much as everyone else does in our town, in part because people with large families stepped forward and said, we would discriminate against large families. Well, I'm not going to speak to that, but it's an interesting question. It's clear if we had carbon taxes and we're pricing aspects of the environment in the way that Michael was talking about it in his initial presentation, that clearly people would think even more than they're already thinking about the cost of children. Finally, I guess it would really, really help if we had governments that understood the importance of having more for everybody in such a way that they understood that having smaller populations rather than larger populations is good for the world we're heading into. It might not be good for the classical economic world that was described in the 18th and 19th centuries, but we're not in the 18th and 19th centuries anymore. We're in a full, very crowded, resource-constrained world. And under those circumstances, it's not important how much your economy is growing. What's important is what's happening in your economy to individuals. And we're now at the point in the developed and the developing world where population growth is actually limiting the availability of the planet. And the share we can each equitably share of the planet and its resources for future generations. So I'm hopeful that, and I think it's actually possible, it's beginning to happen now, I think, that as governments look at our circumstances, they're beginning to think of, are there ways through the exercise of human rights, through human development, that we could see that women can make their own choices about childbearing and begin to reach for a stable population. And I think there's a good chance we could get there before the middle of the century and before 9 billion.
Thank you. Let me open it up to you all, maybe starting here, but please introduce yourself and wait for the mic as well. Yes, you. Using the mic will help because we are recording. Sorry, here it is.
Yeah, this is Sun Jin-yoon. I'm professor at Seoul National University from Korea. So I'm not sure we have foreigners here or not. Anyway, I have several questions, but maybe I have a time limit. So the most important question I want to raise is about population issue. Because Korea, our population growth rate is a little decreasing. So the government project maybe around 2018, our population will decrease. So it became a social problem. So the government made a policy to encourage, give more children. So in the past, the government always announced or declared just to give birth to one baby, either son or daughter. One is enough. But now the policy has changed. The government encouraged people, if they give birth to third child, they give a subsidy. So, as an environmentalist, my major is energy and environmental policy. So I think the scale of population is very important, and it is good to have less population. But our government policy is counter. So what should be done? And I think, and another issue is, I think the number of population is important, but still the per capita consumption is very important. Even though we have less population, but we have more consumption per capita, it will become problem. So that kind of two aspects needs to be considered. And I want to add one more comment. I attended one seminar held by RFF, Resources for the Future, last week. At that time, World Bank and OECD said about green growth. Because I came from Korea, currently Korean government pursue green growth. And OECD just, I'm not sure follow or not, but instead of the concept of sustainability, sustainable development, they are pushing forward the green growth. I think it is not good because it is still the emphasis is given to growth instead of green. So here maybe you use the sustainable prosperity. So I was a little scared about concept. But anyway, I was glad to hear about degrowth. I think it is very important for overdeveloped country. I think we need to include Korea too, because but still, actually, yesterday, in our country there was a general election, but I was very frustrated because the opposite party emphasized the importance of welfare, but the ruling party always emphasized growth. But even though this government made a lot of policy failure, but the public chose the ruling party as the big still ruling party. So I was very frustrated because you mentioned the steps for green sustainable prosperity, so more taxes and distribution. But it is a target. But the problem is how we get there. The way is very important. So I want to find that kind of ways, including population issue too. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take that mostly as a set of comments, and I'm grateful for the comments from Korea. The one thing I'll try to address among the things you've raised is the question of Korea's population policy and those of other countries, Singapore, and others who are concerned about the fact that their populations are aging. And I do this knowledgeable. I've got Lincoln Day right in front of me. He wrote an article for Worldwatch magazine some time ago that was excellent on the issue of population aging. Lincoln's written about a lot. I recommend you Google him in our Worldwatch magazine articles and read what he has to say about it, because it's much more extensive than what I can say here. Aging is a legitimate social issue. It's a legitimate economic issue. The idea of population growth declining means that we will have many more older people. It's not often pointed out that that's largely a result of past rapid population growth. One reason we have such a high proportion of older people is that we had very large families 60, 70, 80 years ago, and we've succeeded, as I don't think anyone would want to roll back, in raising life expectancy and enabling older people to live longer. So that's a wonderful thing. Some societies I think have gotten overly panic-stricken about the idea that they might stop growing. They see other countries growing, and it's so embedded in us that it's part of the growth myth. It's so embedded that we have to keep growing, so that they feel that if we decline in 2050, maybe we'll have 8 million people instead of 11 million people, forgetting that they had 8 million people in 19 whatever, and they were perfectly fine. It's too complicated an issue to sweep under the rug, but my own position, and I suspect it would be fairly common for most of my colleagues, is that aging is a problem that our institutions are good at addressing. It's a problem of readjusting social programs. It's a problem of increasing participation of women and older people in the workforce, valuing older people for the skills they have, particularly as they're healthy, older in life. Whereas population growth, if allowed to continue to the point that aging is no longer a problem, raises issues that we are not good at dealing with, self-evidently by all the comments that we've been making today. And I think if countries saw themselves, going back to Michael's original slide, as thinking cooperatively that the world is in a situation where we all have to work together to solve, and less as our country versus some other country, we'd be less hung up on the idea that we have to grow faster than our neighbors. So the thing I guess I would add that is really encouraging, I think, is I used to, even in the short time that I've been looking at aging, I used to see lots of articles in places like The Economist or Time Magazine or wherever that took the view that, well, we have to encourage women to have more children or we're really going to face a problem. The last couple of years, I think that idea is actually fading, and the stress has been more on societies will have to adjust to aging. One of my 9 steps to avoid $9 billion is do not subsidize, do not have policies that subsidize women for having some definite number of children, whether it's a lot of children or too few, for rights purposes. Not that those policies tend to be so powerful, but it's just the wrong way to go about it. We have to follow what I think is the innate wisdom of women in having fewer children, and then adjust our societies accordingly. And I'm optimistic we'll be able to once we get this right.
How about the gentleman with that?
Hello, my name is Jeffrey. I'm a student at the University of Maryland studying biochemistry. My question is for Mia, actually. I think that education is very important in changing the direction of agriculture and the way people are eating in the U.S. I just wonder that if there isn't a system in place that's holding back the education, because currently our food education comes from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture has a dual role in not only educating what's healthy to eat, what we should be eating, but also on behalf of farmers ensuring profitability and ensuring subsidies and lobbying on behalf of farmers for agribusiness. And it seems that looking towards the government once again is just not going to actually get the education that we need, but rather hijack any routes towards eating better as Americans. And also, it seems as though getting people towards a more plant-centered, more diverse diet is going to be difficult because you have this sweetening of everything, just because you have processed foods which are so unpalatable that they need to be sweetened with things like high fructose corn syrup. I mean, you have Coke back here, and I mean, just by drinking Coke, we're changing our palate and actually making it harder to go and eat a healthy diet, because just education isn't going to be enough. You're actually going to have to change the palate back, because we've come so far in, turning us all into sweetholics. But I do appreciate everything, and thank you very much.
Thanks for that. Some, again, very interesting questions from the audience in all the different presentations so far. Just quickly on that, because I actually don't think we have a lot of time. You make some good points about the situation in the U.S., and so when I talked about education, some of that might be from the government, but that might work better in other countries. Certainly China, I was in China just about a year ago, is quite taken, the government, with the idea of a low-carbon economy. That's something that you hear all throughout China from academics, civil society, and others. Now, I was just told that recently a state development commission actually included as part of advice to the Chinese people in terms of living a low-carbon lifestyle is to reduce meat consumption. So I think there are some opportunities for governments to perhaps take some positive steps. In the U.S., that might be more difficult. As you say, there's lobbying, there's agribusiness. I mean, those forces are also present in other countries, so I don't want to discount that as a potential obstacle. But I do think there's a lot of civil society work that is being done around some of these issues that more could be done, and where the government can play a positive role, I think that would be important. So in terms of the palate, yes, I mean, that's a very interesting issue sociologically, physiologically. One of the points I was trying to make is in many countries that transition hasn't happened yet. And it would obviously be much better for individuals, for societies, for the climate, for the animals, all the issues I laid out, if that didn't take place. And so I do think there's opportunity for re-embracing indigenous cuisines where they have not been swept away. And that I do think there's quite a lot of that, even in very large countries like China and India. So thank you for that.
One last question, I think, already, and I did see your hand last time. Yep, go ahead.
I think it's just recording.
No,
All right. My name is Qin. I'm from China. Currently, I work for Ashoka Rural Innovation and Farming Program. It's a very interesting topic when I talk about think about the populations, because if we talk about the sustainable growth, for China, we're facing one-child policy for years. So the results comes out like now we have more than 50 million male than female age among between 20 to 40s. So I'm thinking when we talk about the growth, how can we address the problem to keep the balance and achieve the sustainable growth? And also think about the degrowth we are talking about for the food. I'm thinking probably we are talking more about we degrowth the calorie, and probably we need to focus on the nutrition, which is a project that Ashoka is working very hard on it. So there is many people in the world probably starving for this to satisfy the nutrition demand. However, probably in China or in America, we need to switch our focus to nutrition to get less calorie, but focus on more nutrition. So it's kind of these two different topics, or address the problem that how we keep the balance. One side you degrowth, another side you keep the sustainable growth. So I wonder how your appearance about to keep the balance. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thanks for the comment, and particularly from China. And far be it from me to analyze China's situation when I'm being addressed by a woman from China, so I'm not sure if I can do that adequately. But I think most of these things, including sex selection of children, are at least amenable to policies. China's policy is much more complex than a one-child policy, although it is very much birth by permission policy. It's not one I would approve of or recommend to any other country. I think there are other reasons that China's fertility has fallen besides this particular policy, but it certainly has played a role in that policy. How much it's played a role in its sex selection is hard to say. Korea, many other Asian countries, and of course India, have similar issues without a one-child policy. So it's very hard to quantify the role that it's played. But I will say this on behalf of China, in addition to the kinds of policies that Mia was talking about. China is aware of the problem of sex ratios. It is a severe social problem, and it is trying to address it through various specific policies. One of them is to increase or give a bonus to pensions to parents of only children who are girls. So that this isn't fully implemented, I believe, yet, but ultimately, if you are the parent of a single child who is a daughter, the Chinese central government will guarantee you a certain pension after you retire that's significantly higher than you'd otherwise have. I'm not sure I'm a big fan of this kind of economic incentive. It gets very dangerous, particularly in a population field. But I think it's admirable that China is trying to think that through. In other countries that have had this problem, there are efforts, for example, to provide free lunches for girls in schools, or free schooling for girls, or simply to use the bully pulpit that governments have available to them to continually remind countries of the importance of full participation of their populations, which means females as well as males, and find ways to demonstrate that girls and then women have equal opportunities in society. So I'm not so optimistic about governments being able to fine-tune the balance of these issues on any aspect of sustainability, but I'm a strong believer that governments can recognize what's happening and encourage balance by finding policies that will at least provide both education and sort of moral direction toward a sustainable balance, as well as, when necessary, some sorts of social or even economic incentives. And I think China illustrates that as well as quite a number of other countries do.
Okay, I'll just be brief. I think your point about the nutrition versus the calories is a very interesting one, and I think the challenge for countries like China, India, and others is not to replicate the way we have created our food system and our ideas about food consumption here in the U.S. So again, I think that there is a a lot of interesting opportunity there to focus more on positive nutrition, nutrient-dense foods that are also more sustainable, more climate-compatible, less resource-intensive. And it would be very interesting to see China take more of a lead in that direction going forward. So thank you for that.
I think we're going to have to end it there, just in fairness to the other panel and to the reception.